Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. This is Pastor Danny, and welcome to the latest episode of Elisha's Bears. Again, thank you for joining and for the follow. And if you're not following me, I would appreciate your starting to do that. I'm terribly excited to have our guest today, Trey Ogle, who was so patient. We had so many technical difficulties. I thought we were going to resort to sign language there for a while, Trey. But Trey is the organist at Central Bearden, which is in Knoxville, Tennessee. Trey, good to have you with us today.
Good to be here. My first time as a podcast guest. I'm a little apprehensive. I don't know how this goes, but
That's it. Well, listen, this will be my first lengthy conversation with an organist, our church musician, and I'm excited about it. Let's start with this, Trey. Can you talk a little bit about your education and your background and how you really, what was your early influences to get into the music world?
well, my early influence, I guess, would be church. I don't ever recall a time in my life when I was not at church on a regular basis. I mean, truly from the time I could walk. I remember running around the church and trying to sneak my way up onto the platform before or after service. And I can vividly remember playing with microphones, but my parents and grandparents all were very, very active in church leadership throughout my childhood, my grandparents especially. And so I was always in church and just always felt drawn to the music. And in terms of playing an instrument, I would hear the hymns that we would sing on Sunday mornings and then be at Mama's house and sneak into the piano room and pick out note for note the melody of those hymns. And that just kind of evolved over time. I started playing the piano by ear, and my grandmother helped coach me along a little. She was a piano player for a gospel quartet back in her younger years. And then from there, when they recognized there might be a little more to it than just a little hobby, I was fortunate enough to have some really good early mentors and ultimately teachers in both piano and organ. I started playing the piano on Sunday nights at the little church I grew up in Sevierville, Tennessee. And I was probably fifth or sixth grade when they started letting me play on Sunday nights. And that's back when churches had Sunday night services.
Understood.
And I
Right.
can't say that I miss those, full transparency.
I got you. I understand.
No, after a while of me getting acclimated and more comfortable and more confident in my hymn playing and preludes and postludes and offertories, the pianist and the organist at my home church, both dear friends and mentors of mine, they kind of cornered me one Sunday and said, "We would like for you to start learning to play the organ." And I had absolutely no interest whatsoever. They said, "Get your papa's key," because my grandparents lived a quarter of a mile from the church, and papa was a trustee and Sunday school superintendent. And so they said, "Get your papa's key and come over and practice some after school through the week, and we'd like for you to start playing the organ some." And I said, "No, that's okay. I'm good playing the piano on Sunday nights." And they said, "Well, a true church musician, a keyboardist, can go back and forth as needed between either instrument." And I still really wasn't convinced, but I begrudgingly agreed and immediately became captivated by the king of instruments. And I will have to say that being able to play the organ in addition to the piano has certainly opened up many opportunities in my life that I never would have imagined otherwise. A long, long way to answer a question, but most of my early influence in music was truly in church music. And I also was fortunate enough to grow up in a school system in Seymour with one of the best choral programs in elementary, middle, and high school, honestly, in the country. So I've always been surrounded by good quality music where the instructors and leaders were striving for excellence. And that's just something that I'm very fortunate and blessed because of.
I was curious because my wife Lori, her mom was the church organist for a number of years. And one of the things that she was talking about is this issue with the pedals and trying to figure out the work with the pedals. And as far as that goes, what do church people not know or need to know about the differences between being an organist and a pianist. And I think, did you call the organ the, what was it, the king of instruments, or what was that phrase you called it?
Yeah, the organ is referred to commonly as the king of instruments. Essentially, you have an orchestra at your fingertips. You have what are considered to be the principles of the organ that are the true organ sound, but so much of the instrument is recreating sounds of flutes or strings or reeds, trumpets, oboes, and that's what ultimately I believe leads the nickname of the king of instruments. But there is certainly a difference. A lot of the hand techniques of scales and earlier piano technique, it crosses over, but there's also a lot of different technique you have to utilize as an organist as well. Of course, incorporating your feet to play the pedals, but there's also differences in technique in your hymn playing and your fingering. The piano is a sustained instrument. You just put that pedal down and the note will sustain even if you're not touching the key anymore. But on the organ, the second you let off of a key, the sound goes away. So you have to learn to adapt that difference as well.
The things I've enjoyed that you do, and I may touch on this later on as well, but you share videos with your rehearsals. I would imagine it looks like you're playing the organ in the sanctuary. And my question is, when you're in that room by yourself and you are practicing, and then you have people come in the room on Sunday morning. Maybe this is just something I wrestle with what I do. Do you ever get nervous? Or is there a difference? Do you sense a difference maybe mentally or spiritually when you're playing by yourself as opposed to people being in the room?
I definitely tell a difference, though I try to convince myself that I don't get nervous anymore, which is probably a bit of a lie to myself.
Understood.
But I've always approached it similar to taking an exam or a test in that when there's people listening, you either get it or you don't, and it's like taking the test, you either know it or you don't. So there's no sense in lingering on it too long.
Well, Trey, when you're playing and this my ear, I have an appreciation at one level for what you're doing, but when you're playing it, do you feel like, oh, I messed up, but maybe most people don't realize maybe you've messed up?
I think that's something that you learn with time and experience that most people don't actually pick up on that unless it's a pretty significant blunder. And at that point, I just kind of laugh at myself.
It's probably more.
Thankfully, those don't happen too frequently.
Yeah, I was thinking it's probably more forgiving and not noticeable based upon what you do versus about what I do,
Well,
in terms of just
perhaps, but also a technique you learn over the years or skill, I guess. Maybe that's the right word for it, but is to cover up your mistakes or make them repetitively so it sounds like you're doing it on purpose.
try. Well, let me pivot a little bit and kind of deal with your philosophy or your mentality as it relates to music and its role in worship. And there are people who would say, and they may choose their church that they go to based upon the music. Just from your perspective, are there certain biblical passages that have influenced you, or can you provide a biblical or theological basis for your approach to music in worship?
Well, I think music and worship, comes up pretty consistently throughout scripture. And I think as a musician, by default, we tend to reference the Psalms quite often. I don't have a specific one off the top of my head, but
No, no, it's like our hymn book that's there in the middle of the Bible, pretty much.
exactly, exactly.
With what I have to do, and that's going to be kind of a point of reference. And of course, we seem to be able to speak to each other. I was thinking about, the Americans and the British jokingly talk about two great people separated by a common language kind of thing. Do you find, just from a ministry standpoint, pastors and musicians, is there a challenge to get on the same page on occasion with how we view things?
Potentially.
I like your facial expression before you answered completely different.
Next question, please.
Yeah, so let's move on to that because, again, we have different, I guess, philosophies about how the worship service is structured and everything. What goes into planning an order of worship? And I'm thinking about your part as an organist. It includes the accompaniment of the songs, and you're trying to make it all tie together for a basic theme. But How do you go about selecting a prelude?
So, personal preference at our church, at the church that I serve, we are a loosely liturgical Baptist church. We aren't strict on following the lectionary, but a lot of times that's going to reflect in certain days of the year and certainly the planning of worship around that. So I personally try to select timely and liturgically appropriate selections. I'm just given the nature of the church that I play in, where we have a blended worship service, I'm not playing Bach on a regular basis, nor would I want to. That's just not who I am as a musician. But I do play a lot of hymn tunes and arrangements of well known worship music, but I
Well,
also too like to tailor it to the rest of the service. If there's a hymn that may not be incredibly familiar to the parishioners, then maybe I'll throw that in as a prelude as well, so that at least they can hear the tune before they have to try to sing it later. But I also try to maintain the theme of the rest of the service as well.
you talked about your influences growing up, and it sounded like it was kind of a family thing, so to speak. But it sounds like, and again, I've enjoyed listening to you play online and when we've been able to be in the room together. I know you developed this love for the hymns at an early age. Do you still find, and I would believe this to be true, that hymns, regardless of how old they are, they still have a place in our worship? And do you think it's a myth that quote unquote younger people may not like to sing the hymns?
I think a myth is a good way to describe that, or just marketing agenda for people that don't necessarily like them and want to frame their church identity in a different way. But I think the hymns certainly are, many are timeless and very steeped in rich theology
Yes.
that transcends generational divides.
We were singing a song, you may have to coach me up on this, on Sunday about from Fanny Crosby. And our ministry music was talking about the name of the song and how Fanny was blind and
Mhm.
how just that information to share about the background of the hymns. That's true really of a number of hymns, isn't it?
It really is. And I would encourage folks who have never really done much of a deep dive on the history of some of their favorite hymns, look up the stories behind them in your devotion time, because it can really transform the light in which you internalize.
One of the, I guess, more modern, the word I would use, are the Gettys and
Yeah.
how they've tried to introduce new hymns. And this might, again, show my ignorance here, but I hear the phrase sacred music. Could you tell me or tell us what sacred music is and how old does a hymn need to be considered a hymn?
Well, you mentioned the Gettys, and we certainly do a steady diet of their music in our worship.
In
In
Christ
fact,
alone, right?
absolutely. But even, I mean, that's getting to be considered old now, believe it or not. But that's a prime example of taking rich theology and setting it to text and singable tunes in a format that lends itself well to corporate worship. And in fact, they just published a brand new hymnal, a print physical hymnal that you can put in your pew racks and
Oh,
people can
man.
open up and turn to the page, which seemingly is becoming a lost, I don't know that art's the right word, but a lost tradition.
There's a Getty hymnal? Is that what you're
It
saying?
it is. It just came out this year. It's called the Sing Hymnal, and it's a great resource. It incorporates a lot of those old nostalgic stalwart hymns of the faith, but also a lot of their newer, what are called modern hymns. So I don't think hymns are going away, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's a different take on modern worship, but I think it's all sacred in nature. Absolutely.
Well, following up on what you mentioned about worship, and I was going to ask from your experience growing up in the church, kind of like me, and based on how we look at one another, I've been doing this a little bit longer, perhaps, than you have. But if you had a definition of worship, how do you know when you have worshiped? And one of the things I deal with, Trey, is every now and then I'll hear someone say, "I didn't get anything out of worship today," quote unquote. How do you know when you've worshiped?
I think you feel it for one, but that's kind of a loaded question. There's a lot to unpack in that question. I think there's definitely a difference in personal worship and corporate worship, but also when we attend church, because obviously in that example, that someone who's attending church and then leaving disgruntled because they didn't get anything out of it, quote unquote.
I
I'm
like
doing
the
air
air
quotes
quotes that
for the
you used.
listeners.
Yes, I want the listeners to know you used air quotes there.
Yeah, absolutely. But, I think that's the wrong approach to worship. We don't go to worship or participate in worship to get something out of it for ourselves. We're not worshiping ourselves. In worship, corporate worship in particular, it's participatory, where we are the performers for God, the audience. And so maybe I didn't hear any songs that I liked. You
Yeah,
might need to, or I didn't like the sermon, didn't
right.
get anything out of it. I mean, we've all been there, but that's on us.
Those lines too, when people say, "I can go to the woods and worship," and then, of course, in what we do, we wanna stress the value of corporate worship. How important would you say the communal element of worship is versus just the individual who says something like what you said, or I was saying, they just don't get anything out of it? How do we continue emphasizing the communal aspect of it?
I have often said that the closest to God I will ever be this side of heaven is when I am seated at a keyboard instrument, be it at a piano or an organ, and whether that's at my house or in a sanctuary surrounded by a choir and a congregation that's singing. There's just something different though. And I too, from a personal perspective, certainly can experience God in a worshipful and meaningful way outside of the four walls of the church, and have and do on a regular basis, and I'm grateful for that. And we have to be willing and receptive of that movement of the Spirit. But one of the more unique worship experiences I have had personally, and you mentioned that I have a love for the hymns and traditional worship, but our church is very blended and we have people across the spectrum, and we all go to lunch and afterwards and get along just fine. But we worship together and we put maybe our personal preferences aside. But
That's
one
it.
of the more unique experiences I've ever had in a corporate worship setting was actually at the Brooklyn Tabernacle in Brooklyn, New York. And they're a very modern, contemporary style church. But one differentiator in that experience was that every single person, without exception, that was in that room for church that day was actively engaged and participating in worship. And you could feel it. You could feel that spirit in the room. And you put yourself at the door. You leave yourself and you check that at the door because you're not there for you. And when you do that, you may get something out of it. You mentioned somebody that says, "Well, I didn't get anything out of it." Well, maybe you came expecting something that isn't about you. But when
Right.
you're willing to let the Spirit lead in those times, then that's when worship can become transcending.
As we're talking, we're entering the season of Advent, and to me, I think you would agree with this. Christmas time for people who aren't necessarily involved in a church, it seems like that's a built-in time to reach out and encourage people to come because it's fresh on their minds. And as it relates to Advent, from your vantage point, opinion, I know, but what are some songs that had to be sung and played around the Christmas season? I see you smiling there. And follow that up with this. Do you get excited about this time of year, or is there a sense of dread like, man, this is going to be a lot of work, or is it a combination?
I think a combination is fair. You might dread all of the work and effort and time that goes into preparation for the season, but once you're there and you're actively a part of it, those are times that you have experiences that no one can ever take away from you. And it truly is a special time, as is Holy Week and Easter and other, more prevalent seasons of the church year. And of course, we all have our favorites in those times. And for me, it's "O Come All Ye Faithful" on Christmas Eve. It's not Christmas to me until we sing "O Come All Ye Faithful" at full tilt on Christmas Eve. And on Easter, it's "Christ the Lord is risen today"
From the grave he arose, would that make one of the top 10?
with a great big tater on his nose.
Yes, I
I haven't done that one in quite some time. I grew up singing that one though, that's
Yeah.
for sure.
I've always wanted to ask a musician this question, and it kind of goes back to the scripture whatever you do in word or deed, do it all for the glory of God. And this is life in the church, and we're not perfect, of course. And is there a balance between doing things with excellence and then performance? Do musicians struggle with that balance? And is there a difference between performance and worship?
That's a great question. I think as long as you're doing it in the spirit of excellence and striving for excellence, I think it can bring glory to God. Absolutely. You kind of
We can
stumped
phone
me
a,
on that one.
we can phone a friend if we
Yeah,
want to.
maybe we should.
Yeah. No, I don't think there's a right answer to that, Trey. Preaching, that's one aspect of the worship service, of course, but you have training in the music field and you want to do a good job, but there's also the sentiment. I think you expressed this earlier about quote unquote not getting anything out of it. That puts yourself in a passive, more of a spectator role. But we want to do our very best, but it's not a performance really. It is worship, isn't
Right.
it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you have to be careful as a musician, a player, a singer, what have you, because you don't want worship to feel performative in nature, at least performative in the aspect of the people on the platform are performing. And I call it platform rather than stage very intentionally
Okay.
because a stage is something you perform on. But many churches now, it is more about performance and the theatrics and what can they do to invoke certain emotions rather than just putting your best out there and allowing the Holy Spirit to do the Holy Spirit's job.
Right. This next one is kind of more of a philosophy as it relates to a worship service, perhaps. Does the music prepare people for the message, or is the music also part of the message?
Yes, music is part of the message in my opinion. I don't think one or the other is more important over the other, but they are both integral parts of a corporate worship service.
This is more of an opinion question, obviously, but what is the state of the sanctuary choir? And are these anthems in Baptist churches, which is our neighborhood, are they going to stick around?
I certainly hope so, and I think they evolve some over time. We certainly sing newer anthems, that may be approached in a more contemporary or modern manner, but at the same time, we pull out those sugar sticks, the majesty and glory of your name, and
Oh, man.
many greats of the 70s, 80s, and 90s that would bring people to their feet or their knees, either one, just as powerfully as some newer stuff. So yes, I think there's a lot of value and additional communal worship and fellowship that comes along with being a part of something bigger than yourself, like a choir or an orchestra.
Yeah, and along along those lines, and this is somewhat similar regardless of the size of the church you are involved with, but planning is vital to worship and church music. And some people use the lectionary, and then you have seasons of the year, which is where we are now. Who do you talk with about planning, and how far down the road do you go in terms of? I'd like to kind of know where we're going so I can select hymns or preludes and those kind of things.
That's something that is done in collaboration with church staff, music minister, the senior pastor, other ministerial staff that are involved on a given week. And similar to talking earlier about the seasonal church year and calendar, that if you loosely follow the lectionary, there's underlying themes that help to guide in that process. But it also has to be a prayerful and discerning process as well.
So there would be a balance of spontaneity, and I'm kind of like that too. I am a planning person. What's funny to me, Trey, is in working with our musicians here, and some of them after a worship service, I'll have someone come up to say, "Man, it just seemed like the Lord was working today. How the music flowed in with the message." And it's like I almost don't have the heart to tell them, "Hey, we do talk, but on
Yeah.
Sundays we do talk to one another." Here's another question that I've thought about. I wanted to ask, is there a difference between singing songs to God and about God, and is there a trend towards one or the other?
I do think there can be a difference, but I think it's more in the spirit in which they're sung.
Because it seems like with some of the, and I haven't done an inventory of the hymns, and I'll be curious about this Getty hymnal that comes out too. I mean, is there a ratio if we were to try to ballpark it? A lot of the songs, there's great theology in these songs, and we sing a lot about God, but also some of the praise courses are sung to God. And I guess as long as there's a balance of both or used maybe an emphasis of both in a worship service, I think that both could have significance to the worshipers, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and, that kinda goes back to the, conversation around which is more important, the music or the message, or is the music preparing us? But, if you look at a worship service as a whole in a similar light of the acronym for praying, so you have adoration, and of course, as soon as I try to quote it, they
I'm
it
trying to hold the sign up to give it to you here.
yeah, thanks.
You're gonna,
Adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication.
that's it.
But, you pray those things. Well, what's to say you don't sing those things too? You
Okay.
sing praises and adoration to God. You sing hymns. There are certainly hymns around thanksgiving. There are certainly more lamenting hymns and confession and supplication too. I mean, how many, back in the day, we called them invitation hymns.
Yeah.
Now they might be a hymn of response, but it's calling us to consider calling on God.
But do we stereotype certain songs in the hymnal as this is just an invitation hymn, and we don't use it at any other point in the worship service? And when you look at the hymns in the Baptist hymnal, or I guess the celebration hymnal, or some of these others, there's a lot of songs that are about praise and being joyful. But to your point, do we do a good job of recognizing these songs of lament because there are those in the Psalms?
I hope we do. I'm sure we can all improve in all aspects of our worship and our, how we reflect and approach worship. But, that's truly just as important as other aspects as well. Because, in the spirit of Thanksgiving, and, this is not an original thought. In fact, this is coming out of our recent sermon series as we've been preparing for Thanksgiving. But if you don't first have lament, then how can you have Thanksgiving?
Okay. And I think that's kind of part of the theology of the music and not just the hymns, but the other kind of songs that we have. Christians, we're not constantly, we are people who have feelings and we go through difficulties. And I guess it's good to have a balance of those songs to give the full range of emotion that we have. And of course, you play what you said, the king of instruments, which is the organ. Would there be an instrument that you would say that would be hard to use in a worship service? I was thinking of Will Ferrell's sketch on Saturday Night Live with the cowbell. Would there be an instrument that someone said, "I play this instrument and I like to use it," and you're thinking, "How's this gonna work?"
Well, I will have to say from experience, one thing that would come to mind would be a kazoo. However, we have used kazoos in worship before and it was quite effective. But you also just have to know what you're trying to accomplish and know the moment in which it's intended. One thing, and I know I have friends that are bagpipe players or pipers. It's really hard to listen to bagpipes inside of an enclosed room. But when
Has it been
done,
done, Trey? Has it been
it
done?
has been done, and done well, but also you can have the piper stand outside the walls of the church in the church courtyard, and it's just as pretty.
I love the bagpipes, like, outside, like you were saying, but I know that that would be the full range and experience of having those things in the room.
You really need to know your space. You need to
Yeah.
know what space you're playing in and adapt accordingly.
This is kind of you're putting it your crystal ball is somewhere in that office. I can't see the whole thing, but if you were to envision the future of church music, where do you see church music going? Or would you like it to go?
I think it will go different directions for different churches. I think it's important for churches to not to become stagnant by any means, but to be aware of your identity and not try to copy someone else just because they're having success in certain areas, because at the end of the day, that may not be where your talent is. But I think in churches, traditional, modern, contemporary, blended, what have you, there's a place for everyone and there's a place for all types of music. The classic NPR saying is, at one time, all music was new.
Yeah.
And I think that's a powerful statement that's relevant to the church as well.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's necessarily one right or wrong way. There are certainly ways to effectively accomplish the spirit of true, pure worship, and strive for excellence in that process.
Well, I've got you for a few more minutes, and I'm going to try to end on a crescendo. You see what I did there?
Okay,
See what I did there?
clever.
Yeah, how about that? We are recording this a few days before Thanksgiving, and obviously it's a time to think about this past year. But Trey, did you offer some words like these are some things when you think about gratitude and Thanksgiving that you would say these are some things that I'm thankful for?
Well, I'm thankful for the gift of music. I'm sure that sounds cliche talking to a musician about music and worship. Um, but music for me has opened doors and provided opportunities that otherwise probably never would have been afforded. And along with that, I don't just mean opportunities for me to play or perform or have those types of opportunities, but the relationships that have come along with those as well. And those communities and friendships and fellowship of like minded believers. And that's just something that's unparalleled and incredibly meaningful. So I'm very grateful for those subsidiary gifts that music provides. And I'm also grateful for the opportunity to play in a church that all types of music and the art are appreciated. And something may not be everyone's favorite, but it means something to someone, and others are willing to allow that give and take because music is a universal language that transcends other divisions. And I truly believe that. And I also believe, going back to my first point, that the best music made is music made with others.
This could have been a whole nother conversation. It might give me an excuse to bring you back later on if we can
Okay.
avoid the lengthy technical issue we had at the beginning.
Well, now that we know how to work the
Yes.
microphones.
Yeah. Well, I think our churches are similar, and I grew up in churches where there was like age graded choirs and music, and we think about music from as adults, but to start with children too, and the benefits of the singing, but there's also the social component that's valuable too, wouldn't you say, Trey?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and referencing scripture, train up a child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they won't depart from it. And if you apply that to ensembles and music, I mean, if you want an orchestra one day, you have to train your children to play the instruments. If you want a choir, you have to teach them to learn to sing in an ensemble. And I can remember those opportunities that I had as a child and how meaningful they were. And two, a lot of the music that as adults we have internalized and reference in those times of sorrow or those times of challenge. A lot of those go back to our childhood that we remember singing next to our grandmother or grandfather or hearing our mother sing in church. And those words never leave you.
Just a few final thoughts about if people wanted to know more about you or your music or could follow you in some way, where would they go and how would they do that?
I am on Facebook. That's where it really started my music, my broader music ministry, if you will. It's Trey Ogle Music on Facebook. I'm also on YouTube. I think if you just search Trey Ogle piano or organ, you'll find me.
Do
And
you
I've
have
just started posting on TikTok too.
Okay. Oh, all right. Well, do you have something called Saturday morning coffee and hymns?
I have. I've had to take a little bit of a hiatus from that, just because the season of life that we're in just hasn't afforded a free Saturday morning in some time. But
I
yeah,
got
that's really what started my online presence or ministry in the yeah, we all remember the COVID-19 pandemic a few years ago. Everyone was just stuck at home and I felt called to share music online because we all needed some music, some respite in that time. And it really evolved from that. During those lockdowns, I would go live on Facebook from the basement where my piano was at the time and just share hymns and worship songs. And people really appreciated that. And it it grew from there and now is regularly viewed by folks in all 50 states and over a dozen countries around the world. And I just never would have imagined that to be possible. Certainly, Coffee and Hymns was a big part of that, and I hope to get back to that at some point in the future. But in the meantime, I'm still sharing music when I can.
Well, I have certainly enjoyed having you on the podcast today. Was there something that I neglected to ask or any final thoughts that you'd like to offer before we part ways?
The only thing that comes to mind was the last question on your potential preliminary questions, and we've covered a lot of those, and you've thrown a few curveballs at me too.
Well, which was one? I know I've kind of skipped around a little bit, but
But
what
I
was
think
one?
the final one was, what is your favorite hymn? And
Okay, let's go with
gotta
that.
gotta answer that one because it kinda ties back into some of our earlier conversations. In reality, I can't say that I have a single favorite. There are certainly times that call for the reflection on different ones, but the theme of my Coffee and Hymns program and ultimately my online music presence is "To God Be the Glory," and so I always try to close out my programs with that, and anytime I give a recital where congregational singing is an option, that's probably one of the hymns that's gonna get selected as well, because I just think that, that encompasses my goal and the goal that we all should have as believers.
Thank you for that, Trey. As I said, I had a number of talking points here, and thank you for being fast and loose and flexible as we've done this obstacle course together. Again, I want to thank you for your time, and
Absolutely.
I want to thank our listeners for being part of this conversation. And again, if you are not following the podcast, I encourage you to do that. We have been spending time with Trey Ogle, who is the organist at Central Baptist Church in Bearden, which is in Knoxville, Tennessee. And until next time, let's keep singing. Trey, thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, and I've enjoyed this.
You're welcome. I'll see you soon.
Alright, take care.